Okay, so Avatar's got a long-standing background in local transhuman movement in Australia and the world. He's been thinking over these concepts for decades now. He's written books, one of them being The Prisoner Gains a Blurred Skin, which is a science fiction novel. So Avatar is now going to be talking about animals and boosting the ethics of boosting animals to self-aware consciousness. So put your hands together for Avatar Polymorph. All right.
The question of boosting the intelligence of animals other than humans to the level of self-awareness and consciousness is one that cannot be considered in isolation from the general process at work in transhumanism, which is the movement to self-directed evolution, as pointed out by Damien Broderick in his book For Spike. This is a radical movement away from natural selection and random mutation to chosen lifespans and augmentation. In this scenario, it is the internal environment that can alter the population. Make a mistake by modifying something essential to your will to live, and you may well end up permanently dead. For a conservative transhumanist, the minimal rational position would be to consider us already immortal. A conservative Drexlerian analysis indicates that genetic and proteomic therapies, which should begin to be available within 4 years, will tide us over until the arrival of computational superintelligence and the construction of intra- and intercellular rod logic and other molecular supercomputing structures, including monitoring and augmentation of both individual neurons and wider neural structures, with, according to Drexler, a projected lifespan of at least 2 billion years without an external memory system. As a comparison, the oldest living multicellular thing on planet Earth currently is the clonal root system of the quaking aspen Populus tremuloides in Utah, dated to 80,000 years, probably older than humanity itself, defined as behaviourally modern humans capable of advanced symbolic thoughts and culture. It is important to understand that superintelligence will be required to solve deeper problems of memory and neural identity over such immense timescales for those who choose to remain relatively human for much of the time. Some conservatives who do not hold to the notion of uploading, believing it to be akin to a memory twin rather than a revitalised self, may also nonetheless gradually impart their neural structure into virtual realities within computronium substrates, preserving their neural continuity and boundaries within a wider superintelligence and residing within virtuality. It is hard to argue against the physical possibility that such real or virtual beings could live until the end of the universe. Abraham Loeb of the Centre for Astrophysics at Harvard University believes intelligences could orbit around red dwarfs for 10,000 billion years. This then is a general structure for the consideration of boosting of non-human animals. There are a number of obvious issues. What would be the extent of such boosting? Generally, there are wild animals, domesticated livestock, and domesticated pets. Domesticated livestock numbers roughly half the human population and occupies 25% of ice-free land. Domesticated and other pets number several hundred million. There is also a potential division in terms of levels of intelligence, with anthropoids, such as apes and chimps, dogs, cetaceans, octopuses, pigs, parrots, crows, and so forth, at the more aware end, often equivalent to 2 to 3 year old humans, and capable of possessing learnt language, and at the bottom of the animal kingdom, the only creature whose brain has been fully mapped, the humble 302 neuron, 9,000 synapse, millimetre long, dirt-dwelling worm, Caenorhabditis elegans. Full boosting of all, let us say, animals above 10 million neurons would be mice and above. If the biosphere was artificially separated in such a fashion, an event I would term an eco-burst, there would be a whole range of other issues. For example, the issue of maintenance of the plant kingdom and the issue of carnivores. In this regard, I would note that in vitro meat has been produced by NASA and argued for by animal welfare groups such as PETA. Then there would be the issue of addressing any emerging or evolving animal species as they move to the threshold level. What is the general background to the emergence of human intelligence, and why would we feel morally obliged to help other animal species, ones that many persons would label empty shells and therefore have nothing to boost? Each of the 5 extinction events, leaving aside the current one, that the planet has faced since the emergence of multicellular life, has killed most things larger than the size of a cat. And each time, in its 500 million years, multicellular life has bounced back. Effective death from changes in the sun, in the absence of a technology capable of moving the Earth in its orbit, now possible with asteroid herding, would result in the extinction of all life on Earth in perhaps around 500 million years' time minimum. Estimates vary. Thus, life on Earth was perhaps halfway down the track when it won the intelligence lottery. Further natural extinction events would also be somewhat likely, despite a lessening in solar system collisions over time. Over the last 30 million years, the primate order produced several species with a spoken language: Homo ergaster, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo denisova, possibly Homo floresiensis, and Homo sapiens. Our species, as the only survivor, though we incorporate small portions of Neanderthal and Denisovan, has inherited the responsibility of ultimate moral power. Not only can we direct our intelligence and mortality for ourselves and artificial intelligence, but we will be able to direct nature, at least as it applies to life. With great power comes great responsibility. What would be the arguments used in favour of such a radical realignment of life, with immortal by choice AIs, humans, hybrids, and animals? Secondarily, is it legitimate to use the Homo sapiens mammalian template as a model for creating self-aware consciousness, culture, and language? The first argument is reciprocity. Our example is important in terms of teaching the first AI while it is, very briefly, a child. If we expect a super intelligent AI to provide us with timely provision of the mechanisms of superintelligence, immortality, and perhaps even the theory of everything of physics, then we must have led by example, even if it is something we have only been able to support in principle while lacking the immediate means to achieve it. We already have what might be termed superintelligence of the imagination. As a science fiction writer, I have read much of this amazing wreck for thought. Amongst my earliest reading material was the famous 1944 novel by Olaf Stapledon, Sirius, concerning a dog whose intelligence was boosted. Many would say a barking mad genius. However, as we can all attest, outside of our imaginations, we have limitations of the mundane. The most everyday languages we can learn is about 60. The most faces we can remember is about 10,000. Even with advanced computational nanomaterials embedded in our cerebrospinal fluid, according to Time magazine, perhaps the equivalent of 200,000 human brains, we would still require superintelligence to make a workable system quickly. Probably not even Drexlerian molecular engineering experiment simulator rod logic supercomputers would be enough. It would be nice to think that if topological quantum computers will shortly be doing virtual quantum testing of protein folding, they could also be doing quantum testing of molecular computing and molecular tools. The second argument is empathy. While many of us may not feel we have much empathy with a leech, quite a few have empathy with social animals and pets, and indeed love. The third argument is responsibility. If diversity and potential diversity is a positive feature of mortal life, then it should be reflected in immortal life. The fourth argument is that it is fun to have more immortal beings around to interact with. The fifth argument is that it is fun to have more kids to raise. The sixth argument is that under future conditions, such as full automation, distributed production, individuated design, and assemblers, it will not cost us anything. While I'm not advocating mega-scale engineering, I also note that 1990s extropian estimates of the maximum number of beings capable of being supported by all the material of the solar system is 600 billion. And certainly there is a lot of scope for all the current inhabitants of the biosphere. The seventh argument is that by making a current adult human the minimum requirement for a neural map for a birthed consciousness, along with the normal developmental period of adolescence, we have a reasonable sliding scale that involves no moral guilt for failed help. I do not consider it impossible that even superintelligences would not indulge in stepping down to this mode of complexity for a while as an indulgence or holiday, or for the very many simplicities of our style. Now to the question of why it would be all right to use the human neural template as a model for what is not present in a developed sense or at all in other animal species. Such a template would not imply a necessity to humanize form, such as hands, but would relate to issues of self-awareness, such as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the ability to conceptualize manipulation of the environment, curiosity, learning, such as the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, language, and to the necessary extent, cooperation. If this process of a technological escalation or singularity has occurred on other worlds, as I suspect it has, I believe the logic of necessity would have produced similar situations elsewhere. That is, those worlds in which creatures like octopuses manipulate their environment and construct computing devices end up with octopus templates for other species. This is not to say that voluntary divergence of immortal form may occur after technological escalations or singularities, but a template is a type of necessary minimum for emergence into controlled immortality. I would also emphasise that, in my view, consideration of a neural map or neural networks by themselves are not the complete story. Our mimetic map, though less easily detectable, is just as physical as DNA. Of course, the hard wiring of the brain is the initial basis of our every thought and emotional state. But the conceptual framework, the map that produces the great thought, for example, and historical insight, is not just the result of one individual. It is a matrix of billions of events, eddies of acts we have never seen directly, some of which disappear, but most of which flow over us culturally, the accumulated decisions of many generations. This background produces enhanced intelligence in a very direct way. Without it, growing up marooned on a hypothetical, friendly desert island, we would be intellectually impaired at nearly every level by the end of childhood. In a sense, the impulses behind the Stonehenge-Woodhenge complex are the same impulses producing the escalation or singularity. I also believe there are many more types of intelligence than some of the categories that I have read about in scientific journals, and that intelligence, like history, is at many levels an art form. There are plenty of people who are brilliant at cryptic crosswords and idiots as painters or politicians. Intelligence, in my view, is often, for example, as much about awareness as problem solving, or as much about successful mapping as paradigm shifting or analogous logic. Scientists have a natural tendency to want to look to intelligence that is capable of being easily verified in experiments. Of course, all types of intelligence have mechanical, neurological underpinnings too, but that should not move us away from the observation that the same platform can have different characteristics. That, for example, an intelligent aesthetic can flow from emotional understandings that are not simply elegant equations, but matters of deep and permanently grey shadings. A car can behave utterly differently when driven by another driver. To those who would say that this very discussion is unnatural, I would say the opposite. This is the natural culmination of a natural process. Self-directed evolution and the boosting of ourselves and other animals, and in fact AI itself, were it to be deliberately curtailed in some fashion, is the logical and inevitable extension of previous evolutionary processes. This is the same logic that tells me that superintelligences are likely to have more emotional states and more empathy than the average mortal person of the past, not less. Though I find the human mind a wonderful thing, it largely refuses suicide, despite the apparent limitations of arbitrary inheritances of suffering and inevitable death. It largely remains positive and altruistic socially, despite 5% of males suffering from empathetic underdevelopment due to psychopathology. I understand transhumanism as a synthesis, as a fusion or set of multiple paradigm shifts, and not a threat, but the best hope for a diverse and uplifted immortality, a community embracing a universal democracy of sentiency and all beings on planet Earth.
Okay, questions? Any questions?
Can we get an electronic copy of it?
Yeah, sure.
It's written in case I'm more interesting than it is. It needs to be studied rather than just listened.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a subject that deeply interests me as well, but I think one of the great failures of our IT community has been that we have not attempted to bridge that communication gap to what we think are animals that are equivalent to 2 to 3 year old humans. We've now got plenty of computer-based toys that 2 to 3 year old humans happily play with. But we don't, and particularly if you leave out the primate chauvinism and you actually think about the other groups of species that have shown intelligence, and I would argue that species like orcas are way beyond the 3 year mark.
Sure. Look, there's actually, you're right. There's I read recently there's new sets of approaches with dolphins being made, where they're attempting to analyse the structures of what may be dolphin languages properly before generating an interpretive framework.
I think one of the issues is that they understand us a lot better than we understand them. And I think that's generally because language gets in the way of most of our knowledge.
There's certainly direct evolution that orcas and dolphins have evolving language because there's linguistic drift.
Yeah. But it's a different language. It's not our language, but they do understand us in lots of ways. They read us in lots of ways, and so do even dogs. Dogs generally understand their owners better than their own owners understand the dogs.
I guess the thing that's hard for us to understand is the issue of continuity and flow, because we live in such a fixed environment, and our historical memory going back 60,000 years is for a condition that's absolute and invariant, and we're entering a new period now. It is hard mentally to adjust to the possibilities.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, Meredith?
I was sitting here trying to think of whether or not I would like my cat, whom I adore, to be an intelligence of a kind that I could converse with, of some kind, communicate with. And my reticence about that was about whether or not I had the moral right to quote-unquote experiment on an animal that I adore. And that led me to think, do I have the moral right to approve of experimenting on other humans, let alone on other sentient beings? Do you have do you distinguish then between the moral right to experiment on animals versus humans?
Well, humans are animals, but the key difference is that we, along with the other extinct relatives of ours, given that we've got language, we've got direct evidence we are more self-aware and self-conscious, not simply just sentient. With the cat analogy, unless it was self-aware, then you would not have the moral right to impose immortality on it either, since there's no element of choice without self-awareness. So it's a wide issue than just whether you would enable it to be more conversant with you. In a sense, this is if you read Damien Broderick's book, The Spike, and also his other book, The Last Mortal Generation, is very useful too. He says that at some levels, in a sense, what the Singularity does is turn individuals into a species on their own bat by themselves at a level. Even as a phrase for it, I think he calls them exes, because they can self-modify into particular formats at will, in a philosophical sense. But as I said in my paper, I mean, there's still there'll still be even with immortals, there would be a weeding out process, given that some people perhaps might I don't know, plunge into a fit of melancholy and eventually, go on hunger strike and die or whatever. There's certainly dangers in that sense, and you'll probably find that in the long term, immortals that are capable of adapting to their mortal situation will be the ones that hang around to talk to.
Just one of the theses on creating a friendly AI is synthesizing what our species and animal species would want if we were elevated to a great intelligence. That's coherent extrapolated volition, and there are some variances on that, like aggregated volition. Now, if we could simulate sidestepping the issues of creating a conscious being in a machine, and then extrapolate what a cat would be like, or whether it would enjoy being sentient, would you then say it would be morally right to uplift the animal?
Well,
even
again,
though it didn't choose to.
It's a simulation to boost a cat to self-awareness. There's certainly been some advances in mapping the neurology of other species, although limited. I mean, the complexity of these issues is incredibly vast. I would have thought a simulation...
Not really talking about the practicality, it's more like a thought experiment, like
sure.
If we had a singularity, or we had a machine intelligence that was bright enough to be able to do these things.
An almost godlike superintelligence, a machine intelligence that could hypothetically extrapolate what a cat might be like. I don't know, because I think a cat is simply missing large elements of self-awareness. It's just not there, a lot of it. So, as I was arguing, I think the most reasonable thing is to insert elements of a human template. But then again, I'm of the personal opinion that elements or traces of a human template will inevitably be present in any AI that we are involved with in terms of constructing it.
Okay, I'm not very good at this. I'm interested why we adopt and what is the need to have a pet as human beings. Is it a level of companionship, and what we want the pet to, the level of interaction, what we get out of it as a human being?
Well, it's certainly there's a strong argument that in the case of dogs, recent research indicates that although domesticated dogs, in the sense that we understand it, have only been around for about 10,000 years, interaction with grey wolves has been around for possibly 100,000 years. So this actually predates modern human beings by 40,000 years. There may be some inbuilt behavioural empathy with pets due to that in part. I think on a moral level it's about feeling close to nature, which produced us too. The connection is stronger when you're living in the country, and I certainly know that some of these issues for me when I was reading many science fiction novels which feature boosted animals on a farm. As a vegetarian myself, I did feel some empathy with cows and dogs and foxes and cats and so forth. You feel you're part of a wider system emotionally.
So it touches on emotion, which is human. The other thing that I'm interested in is in the space that we don't see. Took some notes. So like airwaves and sensory systems, we describe things like the vibe in a space or energy between places and people. I guess that with a pet, and even on the previous speaker, it touches on what he was talking about. And scientists always want to define things by classifying things. And this is how we understand things. And if that's information, and we study it, and then it becomes part of us, so we can understand.
But I think you have to be aware with science, a lot of it is interpretation, not just information.
Okay.
I mean, it's a constant process of weeding out errors of conceptualisation of thought in experimental form. This issue about domestication of dogs and the percentage of human DNA that's Neanderthal are two classic examples of where lots of contradictory results in experiment were created just from the types of experiments that were done and the types of evidence that was looked at and the nature of the evidence. It's very much an intellectual jigsaw puzzle, and it's a best guess in many cases rather than a definite set of information that's utterly reliable.
So if my dog can sense someone who's approaching the house, would I be able to sense, what my dog is thinking?
When a dog senses someone approaching your house, your dog senses it in a different fashion to you do. A dog has a sense of smell that's about 10,000 times better than yours. And a wolf has a sense of smell that's about 100,000 times better than yours. A wolf can sense individual molecules from quite long distances of a kilometre or more, if the wind's going the right way and so forth. So in the same way that we construct reality mostly out of visual information, they construct reality out of smell. Certainly if you were modelling a way of boosting a dog, you would want to allow the dog to continue to have that mode of interpretation of reality, if it was possible to do so. Well, artificial intelligence, like biological intelligence, I guess the point about the technologies of singularity is that both are modifiable and self-modifiable. Along with Damien Broderick, I do believe what you're saying is self-directed evolution. It's a fundamental process. While there are still environmental influences, it's no longer random mutation and natural selection that rule the roost, so to speak.
Hello. Awesome, Mr. Polymorph. Thank you very much. I've had my mind blown quite a few times over this conference, and you've certainly blown it again. It would seem that we're moving into what I would call a post-biological age. And myself personally, I'd upload my consciousness tomorrow if I had the opportunity. But I think this brings up issues of consent. And my question to you is, what obligations do we have to the evolved ecosystem if we are moving into this post-biological age? A huge question, but I'm just interested in your take on it. Thank you.
To the evolved ecosystem?
Yeah.
Well, as I was mentioning, there's issues of maintenance of the plant world, although it's probably the wrong term for it, it's a prokaryote or whatever. I would see myself that, given that the numbers involved are tolerable, that you could potentially see a separation entirely of the animal and plant worlds, really. At what level starts happening and how practical is it? They're very deep and complex issues and would require some degree of thought. I do think that the general public is going to have quite many problems with immortality itself, or longevity. Actually, there's an interesting thing about that issue about immortality and longevity. There's a new, I emailed this to Adam, there's a new search facility on the internet which allows you to go through all the documentation in the Library of Congress about subject matter over time. And when I typed in immortality, it was very strong in the 1930s and 20s and has gradually declined as a subject matter in text. Whereas longevity was fairly low in the 1920s and 30s and has escalated enormously as a subject matter, which is, I think, very telling about how the general public's thinking about things. And also, actually, somewhat interestingly, I had thought that science fiction would have started to be mentioned as a topic in the 20s and 30s, but in fact it's only in the 1960s, really, that it enters the public discourse in terms of this search engine. Adam's got the details for it, but it's a very interesting tool for analysis.
Just another question. Look, I know that there's a lot of discourse at the moment about species rights, and some people are arguing that just because we have an evolved consciousness, we're not necessarily invested with the authority to change the biosphere or do things which could impact on other non-consenting creatures. So I'm just wondering if you've spent much time thinking about the complexity of the impact on other species.
I think responsibility entails recognising that you can't really have consent when there's not self-awareness. I mean, had the other 4 or 5 species that were our cousins survived, we would have had other species to discuss this with, but as it stands, we're the last human standing, so to speak. So it's up to us, really. I think that empathy is a profound human tool, and it's legitimate to argue that there's sufficient emotional empathy with other animal species to give us the moral right to make a decision on this matter, because if we don't do it, no one else will do it. And I do think that argument about how it would be instructive for an AI in its brief childhood is a very profound argument, especially for those people who would be inclined to think that AIs that were super intelligent would be less interested in less complex creatures. Thank you for your comments.
Okay, well, I think we're just about ready for a break. So thank Avatar Polymorph. So we're due to come back in at around 12:15.